Today we're talking about mixed-use districts, and this is kind of an exciting new aspect of zoning in Indianapolis. What I'm going to do today is take you through all of the districts, highlight some of the differences across those districts, and also give you some background on why we have some of the regulations that we do. The mixed-use districts are kind of an all-new thing for Indianapolis. What I wanted to do first is to give you an overview of why we put this new zoning classification in place. You're more aware than anyone. It's an emerging trend in development and redevelopment. We've seen a lot of it in the downtown area, and what we wanted to do is to expand it to the entire city so that outlying areas and other parts of the city have that option for putting into place the mixed-use type of development. It most often combines residential use with some type of commercial use. For example, offices or retail. But as you'll see when we go into the permitted uses, we have also included some light manufacturing and lighter industrial uses into the mix as well. The mixed-use development is a really important part of transit-oriented development. As we're trying to encourage greater use of our transit system, the mixed-use development option is an important component of encouraging transit usage, where you can put residential right with the places that people work, and that can serve as a way of encouraging transit usage. An important thing that I want to emphasize about mixed use in Indianapolis is that we have gone with the approach that you can mix the use in one building, or you can have a mix of use in adjacent buildings. That you can have single-purpose buildings in a mixed-use district, or you can put more than one use in a single building. That's an important element for Indianapolis. Many other communities, when they talk about mixed-use development, they do require that there be two or more uses in every building. We have chosen not to go that route for a couple reasons. The main was we wanted to give developers options, and there are some building types that developers that may want to go into a mixed-use area, but they have a building that they want to keep all residential or all office, and we want to encourage that to get the new development and redevelopment. So that's an important distinction that we have here in Indianapolis. So what makes mixed use? As I said, it's a combination of more than one land use type in a district. Typically, residential is one of them, combined with commercial. It can be retail, it can be office uses. And when you have a mixed use, it can be either horizontal, where you have one use here, a second use across the street, or it can be vertical, where you have one use on the ground floor and a different use above. But again, Indianapolis will allow both types in its mixed-use zoning districts. So always keep that in mind because it's an important element. As I said in the introduction, we have 4 mixed-use zoning classifications. MU1 is a renaming of the C2 district. Any property that's zoned C2 now, on April 1st, that property will become MU1. MU2 is a renaming of the C3C district. So again, any property that's zoned C3C right now, on April 1st, it will become MU2. MU3 and MU4 are all new districts. There is no property, no land in Indianapolis right now that has the MU3 or MU4 zoning classification. After April 1st, that will become an option. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of those two districts because they have some special features that I want to make sure you're aware of. But as we're talking about it, it's likely to be a while, perhaps as much as a year or more, before you will see properties zoned MU3 or MU4, but I'll explain why in a little bit. What I'd like to do now is take you through some of the details of the MU1 zoning district. As I said, it's a renaming of the C2 classification. The purpose of this, in our introductory session, I told you about how important the purpose is in Indy Rezone. Read through that purpose statement for the MU districts because it describes what we're trying to accomplish. In the MU1, we're trying to get that combination of high-rise, office, and residential uses into a single zoning district. Generally, you'll find it along arterials or transit routes, but typically not on smaller streets. We're trying to get this as a use, as a zoning option on major arterials and transit routes. The other thing we're trying to accomplish with the MU1 district and the changes that we've put into it is creating a good pedestrian experience. For the mixed-use districts, the role of the pedestrian is really important. It's not just a drive up, use it, drive out. We want to create a pedestrian experience in these mixed-use districts. And this is an important thing to understand about MU1 and MU2. Like the C2 zoning classification or the C3C, this zoning classification can be applied to individual parcels, individual properties. It does not have to cover a larger area. That's true of the MU1, and as we'll see later, it's not true of MU3 and 4. The MU2 district, renaming of the old C3C classification. Here we're trying to get this mix of residential, retail, offices, and we're introducing the potential for light manufacturing in what we will now call the MU2 district. But the whole idea is to create this in a neighborhood context. Again, we're trying to create that pedestrian activity at the street level, and we're trying to offer housing options. With the mixed-use 2 district, it's introducing another housing option into a neighborhood setting. So that's an important thing that we're trying to accomplish. Again, like the MU1, the MU2 can be applied to individual properties as well as adjacent parcels. So it can be applied on a smaller scale. MU3, as I said, an all-new zoning classification. Here we're trying to create compact areas of mixed use. We're trying to create a higher density of housing and uses, a variety of commercial and light industrial uses into a concentrated area. Again, this is one that we're going to see focused on key transportation corridors as well as transit stops. In other words, where is there going to be a major transit stop? Well, there'll be more pedestrian activity. That's where we want to see the MU3 district, or along a major arterials or a major intersection, or possibly even an interchange. Key thing about MU3, before an area can be zoned MU3, there first has to be an adopted plan by the Metropolitan Development Commission. In other words, the area has to be planned in detail before a mixed-use 3 zoning classification can be applied. The other is we've set a size parameter. An MU3 district has to be at least 20 acres and something less than 50, between 20 and 50 acres. So we're trying to create that area of mixed use here, not individual parcels, but an area of mixed use. That's important for the MU3 district. MU4, it's similar to MU3. It's an all-new zoning classification. We're trying to create that combination, higher density transit-oriented development with residential, commercial, and light manufacturing. Here, we've added a couple of additional parameters. It must be located at an existing or planned transit station. This is looking ahead into the future where we envision Indianapolis having transit stations, be they for bus rapid transit or maybe long-term light rail. But this is where the MU4 district will go. And we're trying to create a separation. So MU4 districts have to be at least a half a mile from each other. The idea is we want to create pockets, nodes of this higher density use along a transit corridor. Again, it must have an approved, MDC approved plan in place before it can be rezoned, and we've set size parameter. This one is smaller. We're envisioning this as the core of a mixed-use development area. So the size parameter is it must be at least 8 acres, but no more than 25 contiguous acres. So that's kind of the quick overview of the all four of the mixed-use districts. Now I'm going to go into more detail on the development regulations for these. I'm going to focus on the first two, the MU1 and the MU2, because those are the ones that you are going to have to deal with right off the bat on April 1st. As we've talked about before, be sure when you're talking about or working with the mixed-use districts, always refer to Chapter 742, which is the district description, and it's particularly important for the mixed-use classification, and then Chapter 744, the development standards, and then we'll talk last, the permitted uses. So when we're talking about development regulations, Chapter 742 and 744 are the important ones. Because we're encouraging this combination of uses into one zoning classification, and we want to emphasize pedestrian activity, we've added development regulations specifically oriented to pedestrians. Each primary building must have at least one pedestrian entrance on the primary street facade. That's a design requirement in the MU1 district. If the building's located on a corner, we give them the option. It may be located on the primary street facade, or it can be, the pedestrian entrance can be located on the corner, kind of serving both frontages. We've given that as an option. Each pedestrian entrance must be clearly defined in the design, that by looking at the building, it's clear where is the pedestrian entrance. That's a requirement. And each pedestrian entrance must include a window, either in the door or adjacent to the door. We want to have that openness aspect of where people are entering. That's important for safety. In the district description, this illustration is in place, and this is to give you a better idea of what we mean by clearly defined pedestrian entrances. They can be defined by a projecting feature. They can be defined by a change in material, a change in depth in the facade, or a change in color. But the design must include an indication that where the pedestrian entrance is located. With the MU1 district, we also have transparency requirements. Tamara talked a little bit about that last week when we were talking about the commercial district. We've included similar transparency requirements in all of the mixed-use districts. That key area between 3 to 8 feet of the front facade must, at least 40% of it, must be transparent, must include transparent features. Because we have a mixed use option in buildings in the MU1 district, if it's a non-residential use, that we say that transparency must be two-way. You must be able to see in and out. If it's a residential use or a live-work use where you have privacy components, we say the transparency must go to common areas, like the entrance lobby of a multifamily use, for example. Or if it's a live-work, if the work portion is in front, you must be able to see into that work area. So we're making accommodations for different uses, but we want to maintain that notion of transparency at the street level. No more than 30% reflection on the glass materials is allowed. And we have the same provision that we had in the commercial districts, and that is if you're replacing windows in an existing structure, you have to include the original outline of those windows. That you can't use this as a justification for reducing the size of your transparency if you happen to already exceed it. That's the key notion of that last provision. Remember we talked about, for this table, dimensional standards. It's in chapter 744, and what I've put up for you, I've highlighted or kind of dimmed the other three, so focus on the MU1 district for now. I want to make 3 points about this table. Key thing, front yard setback. You'll see we have established both a minimum and a maximum front yard in the MU1 district. We now say it either has to be at least 12 feet from the property line or no more than 40 feet from the front property line. A minimum and a maximum front yard setback. Second, here we've set a minimum building height. In the MU1 district, the building has to be at least 25 feet tall. In essence, no longer can you do a one-story building in the MU1 district. There's no maximum, but we've set a minimum. A new building must be at least 25 feet tall in the MU1 district. Third thing I want to highlight on this one is open space. We talked about it for the multifamily development. You'll see for the mixed-use 1 district, we do not have an open space requirement in the dimensional standards. However, when you read through the additional regulations in the MU district, we do have a provision that says in the MU1 district, at least 55 square feet of usable outdoor space must be provided for every dwelling unit. It's similar to what we have in place for the regional center, but we don't say there's an aggregate minimum or maximum, but we do say for every dwelling unit, you must have at least 55 square feet. And that usable space can be balconies, porches, patios for individual units, or they can include and can count common area outdoor space. They can combine those two. But in the aggregate, it must come to that 55 square feet per dwelling unit. Any questions about those two dimensional standards? Yes?
Oh, well, this is actually a question back to the kind of the window transparency thing. I just had a clarification that I wanted to ask on this, because the way that it's written, it says that the replacing window must match the building's original window opening within a tolerance of 2 inches of each opening side. Is the only, I mean, it's written in a way that makes it sound like, I mean, I know the purpose is that you're trying to make sure it's not decreasing the transparency, but it also is written ambiguously enough that it almost sounds like it's not allowing the windows size to be increased if they wanted to, say, increase a window's size for replacement of windows. is that something that, I mean, I guess as far as that goes, is that something that was intentional as far as the replacement?
I'll answer that. There's two aspects to respond to your question. First of all, when we said original opening, it's what is structurally there for the opening. Now, did we want to prohibit expansion? Not necessarily. A key thing that we want to do in all of these development standards, particularly in mixed use, is to create the set of rules that for the most part gets us a development pattern and a development, and in this case a building, that is attractive and therefore long-term viable and vital. And so we don't want to distort that, because if you look at a building as a whole, the windows are really kind of like the eyes of a building. And if the windows get skewed out of proportion with that building, it can really mess things up. Now, does that standard totally eliminate that possibility? No. But we think it puts it into a manageable area. So I hope that helps.
So with the open space, back to open space requirements, we've also, because the front of the building is so important in a mixed-use district, we've added additional regulations in terms of what you can do in the front yard. We do say that outdoor seating or patio uses in the front yard are permitted in the MU1 district. That's a pedestrian-friendly activity in the front yard. However, game courts cannot be put in the front yard. Another thing we're trying to do is we're trying to, while we don't require it per se, we do say that if you have an accessory use in a MU1 building, that accessory use, if it's retail or service or a commercial activity, it cannot exceed 10% of the gross floor area of the primary building in which it's located. So we set an upper limit for that kind of retail, service, or commercial use in the primary building. And we say that no single accessory use shall exceed 5,000 square feet in gross floor area. So we set some parameters. We're looking for that combination or mix. It's not a requirement. So if they want to do a single purpose building, they can. But if they do bring in a second use into that building, we set some parameters for how much of that accessory use, how large that accessory use can be. Of course, vehicles are very important, how we regulate vehicles in the MU1 district. This is just to give you an understanding. We'll talk about parking in more detail later, but I want to give you an idea of how we're regulating vehicles in the mixed-use 1 district. The first one's a very important provision. We're saying no parking is allowed in front of the building in the MU1 district. In fact, when you look at that particular table, table 744, 404, you'll see that applies to all of the mixed-use districts. We do not allow parking in front of the building. If you do have surface parking, it cannot be any closer than 20 feet of the primary street frontage. So if you've got the building frontage here, your parking cannot be in front, but it can be in a side yard. But the edge of that parking has to be set back at least 20 feet from the front of the building. Again, we're trying to create a more pedestrian-friendly experience along the street frontage. Drive-through facilities cannot be located in the front yard in the MU1 district. Curb cuts are permitted only if you cannot get access to the site from an adjacent alley. So if there's an alleyway, if there's an alley available that borders the property, that has to be the access point going forward in the MU1 district. If you do put in a curb cut, the zoning regulations indicate it can be no wider than 24 feet. So these are some important, explicit regulations that we have in the MU1 as it relates to vehicles.
Is that 24 feet just in the MU1 districts, or does it for any of the districts?
As we go forward, that is the maximum we set in all of the mixed-use districts. I wanted to highlight it here, but in fact, that's where we allow curb cuts. In the others, the maximum width is 24 feet.
An example of a kind of drive-through facility that would be allowed in an MU1? Is that just any kind of drive-through? I mean, what kind of uses, commercial uses, would we expect to see in an MU1?
Like a bank.
The bank would be the biggest one, the first one that comes to mind.
Would be one
Maybe a pharmacy. On MU1, remember, that's the node, a node mixed-use development. And so we hopefully will have a fairly high-rise tower, and then maybe the first 2 floors be commercial activity. That first floor may very well contain a bank, and they might have a drive-through going down the back, you know, sweeping in off the alley and out the alley, or a pharmacy or something like that.
So that's the overall picture of the development regulations for the MU1 district. I'd now like to move on to the MU2 district. Remember, this is the renaming of the C3C classification. And with this one, again, I'm focusing now on the physical layout regulations. With the MU2 district going forward, we've set a standard that the primary street facade of each building, of the primary building, must occupy at least 65% of the lot width at the frontage. So now what we're starting to get into is the idea of filling the lot from a pedestrian perspective. So we're now saying if you have a lot that's, let's say, 100 feet wide along the primary street frontage, that building has to cover at least 65 feet. It must be at least 65 feet wide along that primary street frontage. If it's a 200-foot lot, it has to be 130 feet wide. We're trying to encourage that filling in of the street facade. So that's an important requirement. Of that frontage that's along the primary street, we're saying the building has to be at least 65 feet wide. We're also saying at least 65% of that 65 feet, in this case the math takes it to about 42 feet, must be located between the minimum and maximum build-to lines. So not only do you have to fill it, the building has to be 65% of the lot width, but we're saying 65% of that total width has to be within the minimum and maximum build lines. So you can have a notch, you can set back part of it, but at least 65% of the building width has to be within the minimum or maximum build-to lines. Again, trying to create that fill of the front.
I'd like a picture.
I'm more the talker, camera's a better drawer.
Well, there's a room, if there's a whiteboard in the room, it's everything I can do not to draw on it, just so you know. Okay, let's just start with our little street, our little curb, and then of course we've got a wonderful sidewalk that we're going to put in here, and then we hit that the right of way line. We'll put right there. Well, no, that's wrong. Right of way line's going to be right behind the edge of that sidewalk, so there's the right of way. And then we have hit that minimum setback, which is 5 feet in the MU1, right?
We're in MU2.
For MU2? Okay, good, okay. All right, what's the maximum?
20.
20 for MU1? Okay, great.
MU2.
MU2, maximum setback is what? Okay, okay. Okay, so we got the maximum setback there. And we have this lot here. Here's the center line. Woo! A lot of black lines on here. We're going to just have a very generic square lot, and because it makes math easier, it's going to be 100 feet, which rarely they are. They're usually less, and where we expect this to happen. What we want to see happen is 65 feet of that 100 feet needs to go along the frontage, and the frontage is this line right here, which is along the right of way right here. That's that frontage line. 65 feet of that needs to be occupied with the building. Now, if we just said that standard, the building could still be clear back here. But we want the building up front, and so we said 65% needs to be between the minimum setback and the maximum setback. So I can have, okay, I'm just going to guess here what this is like. I'm going to put it right here, and it's about 65%. And I'm going to have my building come back like this. So there's my building. And from here to here is my 65 feet. And you'll notice it's between the maximum and the minimum. It does not need to be straight like that. It can be at an angle, which given today's weird, or actually they wouldn't put it that way. Let's just make this a little more realistic. They would probably go like this. We'll fill this in. Given today's architectural preferences, you know, with the weird angles and stuff. As you see, from here to this point is 65 feet in between these two lines here. Clear as mud, right? Yep. If we didn't have both those standards, the building could very well easily be back here with a sea of parking in front. And that doesn't really get us a walkable, pedestrian-friendly place. So we had to have both standards. Questions?
Because it's both. The building width has to be.
Exactly. Perpendicular. Now, the other thing it says, what it might have, you know, and this gets into a very expensive building, but nonetheless, it could happen. Actually, I could very easily see it happening. Is they could have something that goes like this, back up here, and then over here, and then back down here. And then it probably, since I took that chunk out, it'll probably have to go back over here. You could have a building with this little alcove back here. But this little alcove, believe it or not, doesn't meet that maximum setback, so you can't count that. So we need to have this dimension A of this right here, and this dimension B, those two need to add up to 65. And the whole concept is to make it a nice street wall, a pleasant street wall, a comfortable street wall for people to walk and shop and do what they do. So there you have it. Any questions? Yep. 65%
of the building.
A lot.
of the frontage. A plus B must equal at least 65% of the frontage. It is not the measurement. So I could very easily have, and let's try this. It's really just make this the most bizarre building ever. So here, I wouldn't take the measurement at the front because I've got an angle. I would take the measurement right here, the longest point at the maximum setback right here, because this is the biggest distance. So I would take that B measurement up here. If you want me to explain it more, you don't have to raise your hand or anything, just shake your head no and I'll see it. Again, you'll take the widest measurement. So you'd have the A and the B back here because it's the widest because there's an angle there. You asked me specifically, is that 65% of the frontage or 65% of the facade? And I, going from my memory, instead of reading the book, said frontage. And it's really facade.
So, additional design regulations that we have in the MU2 district. These are a repeat of what we went through for the MU1. It's the same thing. Each primary building must have a pedestrian entrance oriented, at least one oriented to the primary street facade. That corner option, you can put it, if it's at an intersection, you can put it at the corner if you want. Must be clearly defined and must include a window with any pedestrian entrance. Those are a repeat of what we had in the MU1. And so you'll see in the district, in chapter 742, in the district explanation, that same illustration to show what we mean by change in material, change in depth, or projecting feature to highlight the pedestrian entrance. The MU2, we start getting a little more complex in our development regulations. Here, we're anticipating the possibility of multiple tenants on the ground floor, a strip, what we might call a strip center, but it will have a different look, but that concept. And in the MU2 district, what we say is that if you have multiple tenants on the ground floor, each of them has to have a pedestrian entrance. If you have multiple tenants on the ground floor of a building, each of them must have a pedestrian entrance. So that again, as people are walking by, they have direct options for access to those tenants. And because we're talking about much smaller setbacks, the doors cannot open onto any sidewalk. We have a provision. And I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. We also say that you don't have to cross a non-pedestrian area. In other words, if there's a driveway, you can't have a driveway where pedestrians would have to cross to get access. That's what we mean by non-pedestrian area. So we're more stringent requirements for pedestrian access in the MU2 district. In the MU2 district, you'll see later on, and we talked about this before with the dwelling things, we do allow single-family attached dwelling units in the MU2 district. So if you have one of those single-family attached dwellings that faces a local or collector street, each one of them has to have their own separate pedestrian entrance. And then here's what I jumped ahead to. If you have ground floor doors and windows that face the sidewalk, they cannot project over into the sidewalk. That's a requirement as well. Because again, we're anticipating buildings being closer to the sidewalk, but we have that provision to prevent intrusions into the sidewalk.
Can I interject something here? I'd like to talk a little bit about the entrances and explain a little bit why and highlight a couple of differences. In MU1, you don't have the requirement, let me go back one slide. Is that connect? Yeah. You don't have this requirement here in MU1. Because MU1 is that node type development. MU2 is the corridor type development. And back at the very, very beginning, as John explained, we made the districts more distinct in development standards to fulfill that purpose. So on the MU2, where you have to have the access on each one, that's along a corridor. Think, if you will, 10th East 10th Street, actually Massachusetts Avenue is good. You know, where you've got the buildings right to the street, and you don't want you want people to know how to get into those buildings. And it may seem like a silly requirement that of course you would have to have your access there, but believe it or not, on Mass Ave there is a building, it's a brand new building too, brand new building. They filled in a vacant spot between two buildings, and it does not have a door on Mass Ave. I know, it's crazy. I saw all those looks. Yes. Look and see if you can find it. Whoever can come back next week and tell me, or give me, no, better yet, give me a picture. I will have a special surprise for you. Okay?
You may need more than one surprise.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, you bring it here, you bring it in and show me that, and I'll give you a surprise. But that's corridor development, and we want people walking up and down the street, right? And so they need to have something to walk to, a purpose. We need the entrances. Same thing on the entrance requirement where you've got to have a projecting feature or something that calls attention to that entrance. I mentioned that during this process, one of the groups that participated was IMPD. This is a classic crime prevention technique that IMPD is advocating, and that is, and what they call it is a celebrated entrance. Tell me if it is not funny to see police officers say celebrated entrance. It was humorous, but they do, because in an emergency, people need to know right away where to go. And I'm sure each one of you have gone to either like a warehouse area, you really find them there, or sometimes commercial areas where you walk up to the building and they just got that commercial glass curtain wall and it all looks the same, and it's like, where is the door? Because it's just like the windows. That is not good. that does not foster a positive environment for people to be pedestrian and want to be there and walk around. It may work in auto related, but it doesn't work for pedestrian. And so this is a very big, important thing from a crime prevention and safety standpoint. Now, I don't think I need to, but I think I want to make the connection that Indianapolis has a crime issue. We all have to be a part of the solution. IMPD is counting on us to do what we can. It's not a lot, but we can do some things to help them. And so that while this might be easy to let slide, it's more important than you think. In the soapbox.
Thank you, Tamara. Back to where we were about the single-family attached and the ground floor doors and windows not projecting onto the sidewalk. Think of this next regulation. Think about a structure that's located on a corner. There's a primary street and a secondary facade, secondary street facade. We have transparency requirements in the MU2 district. What we're saying is on that secondary street facade, that as an alternative to transparency, we are saying you can provide art, installed art along that secondary facade as an alternative to the transparency requirement. The art has to cover the same area, surface area, that you'd have to provide in transparent materials, but you can do that as an alternative to windows. So we're trying to encourage public art and also give builders an option. If they don't want windows along that secondary facade for whatever reason, if they provide public art in the same proportion to the transparency requirement, they can do that. So this is a way adding to the options for developers. The second one is that same replacement, because this is a renaming, so we're going to have existing buildings in the MU2 district. So replace the windows, you must match your original opening. And then no reflection of more than 30% of visible light for the glass material. MU2 allows this complex mix of uses. So if you have a non-residential use, the transparency must be, again, be between that 3 and 8 feet above grade level. If you do have residential uses or live-work uses, the transparency must go into the common areas. It's not required to go into the living areas. If you have individual dwelling units, single family attached, the transparency requirement can be translucent or opaque. So the transparency requirement along the primary frontage, 30%, 20% along any secondary street frontage, and then above the first level, 15% transparency. So this is a secondary street. If they did not want to put this transparency up here, they would have to cover that same 15% with public art, with a display of art as an alternative. That's how they could meet the transparency requirement along the secondary street, either up there or even below on the grade street level as well. This is an excerpt from Table 744-201. As you're thinking, this is where I go to for my development regulations for the dimensional standards. For the MU2, again, what I want to point out, we do have a minimum and a maximum front setback in the MU2 district. That's really important. Again, a minimum height as well as a maximum building height. We're trying to encourage that density of development. Lastly, open space. Again, in the MU2, there is no open space requirement, even though there are residential uses. MU2 is different from MU1 in that there is no parallel requirement of they must provide 55 square feet. We don't have that, we do not have that requirement in the MU2. The thinking behind that is MU2 is going to be a complex mix of multiple uses. We're not requiring that open space because uses of structures may change over time. So we don't have it as a requirement. They may well elect to put it in, and most probably will provide some open space, but they're not required to have usable open space for residential uses in the MU2. So that's an important distinction. We're trying to encourage multiple uses. So no single commercial establishment can be larger than 8,000 square feet of gross floor area. You can put outdoor seating and patio uses in the front yard, encouraging the pedestrian. That's a pedestrian-friendly activity. And like I said, there is no usable open space requirement for dwelling units in the MU2. Again, that is the notion of building flexibility over time. Vehicle regulations, again, no parking allowed in front of the building. No surface parking permitted within 25 feet of the primary street frontage. So if you have parking in the side lot, it cannot be any closer than 25 feet from the front of the building. It can't be in the front yard, but if it's in the side yard, it cannot be closer to the front facade, primary front facade, than 25 feet. Drive-through facilities cannot be located in a front yard. Again, curb cuts only if there is not access from an alley, and any curb cut that is allowed cannot exceed 24 feet in width. So we've gone through the MU1 and MU2 in some detail. I think this might be a good time to take a 5-minute break. Okay, so now what I want to do is briefly take you through the MU3 and MU4 districts. As I said before, we're likely looking at a year before you'll have to deal with properties that actually have this zoning classification. But I want you to at least get a flavor for how these upcoming districts will differ from the MU1 and MU2 districts that you'll be dealing with right off the bat. Remember, I said the MU3 has to have a plan in place before any of the properties can be rezoned. It has a minimum size, so we're talking about 20 to 50 acres of geography that will have one zoning classification, an MU3 zoning classification. So we're talking about a larger area than individual properties. And we've set some zoning regulations that anticipate regulating a larger geography that has a very detailed plan that identifies where are the pedestrian ways, what are the walkways, what are the streets that will deal with commuter traffic, what are the primary streets, what are secondary streets. So each one of those will have street frontages defined in the plan. And so these do have some design details that are based upon what street frontage the buildings or properties located on. Big things. If it's an MU3 area, any project with 200,000 square feet or more of ground floor area, they must have 20% residential, which in this case would be 50,000 square feet. Unlike the other two mixed-use districts, we will impose build lot coverage requirements. So in the MU3 any building will have to cover at least 50% or no more than 80% of the lot. We're trying to get lot coverage in the MU3 zoning district. We'll have different design requirements based on the frontage types. There are rigorous minimum and maximum building heights in the MU3. We're trying to achieve a certain level of density. And what we've added are building height bonuses, so that if you include residential use in your building, you can go higher, you can go taller. So there's an incentive to encourage residential development in the MU3 district. It will have similar transparency requirements that you've seen in the other districts, other mixed-use districts. It will have vehicle regulations. No parking allowed in front of building. The aggregate parking requirement in an MU3 district will be 1 space per 900 square feet, regardless of use. So building size drives how many parking spaces are required, regardless of use. And again, the idea is changing mixes of uses in a given building. No parking lots within certain frontages. No curb cuts along what we'll call pedestrian frontages. There'll be certain streets within an MU3 district that are designated as pedestrian ways. No curb cuts at all in those frontages. No, on the other streets, only if they can't get access through an alley, can't exceed 24 feet. And in the MU3, we'll limit how close the curb cuts can be to any intersection or other curb cuts. Minimize the disruption created by curb cuts. MU4, the same thing. It'll be the larger geography, 8 to 20 acres, trying to encourage dense development. Minimum lot coverage, 60%. They can go up to 90% lot coverage. So again, trying to get complete build out on all the lots located within a MU4 district. Similar, there will be design regulations depending on what frontage types, minimum and maximum building heights. Again, bonuses, building height bonuses if they provide residential uses. And then in the MU4, if the residential project is over 5,000 square feet, they have to attain a certain density of units, only in the MU4. And that will be 25 dwelling units per acre. We're trying to create that residential density to help serve the transit station or transit node that is the centerpiece of any MU4 district. The MU4 district will also have more detailed design requirements. There must be articulation along the frontages. There are certain roof articulation requirements. Again, as we go up in the mixed-use classes, the design requirements will become more rigorous. Parking. What's different about MU4? No off-street parking is required. None required. It's at the core of the transit area, similar to how we treat downtown area. But if you elect to provide it, which you can, there are regulations on how close it can be to frontages. You can't put any parking in front of the building. No curb cuts along the pedestrian frontages. These are all very much like the MU3. So no parking required, off-street parking required, but if you do provide it, specific regulations on where you can place it. So that's, I hope you've been able to see how the MU districts are configured. The idea, MU1 at nodes, high rise, MU2 along corridors, a more neighborhood base, MU3 transit area, key corridors, a more dense type of development than you'll find in MU2. MU4 at a major transit center or station, and it's the highest density of uses that we're trying to accomplish in the MU. So we've talked about sort of the physical parameters of each of these zoning districts, how the buildings need to be configured. What I'd like to do now is take you through the permitted uses, because in a mixed use, as I said at the outset, it's a combination. You can have residential with commercial. You can have residential with offices. You can have offices with light and some light manufacturing. So what permitted uses also helps distinguish these 4 mixed use types. When we go across these, you'll see there are some notable differences in terms of what types of residential uses, what type of dwelling units are permitted in each of the mixed-use districts. As always, when looking at the use table, look for the use-specific standards. So when you're looking in your use table under the MU and find a permitted use, there are often in the use-specific standards that apply specifically to mixed-use districts. So always check the use-specific standards. Here, what I've pulled up are using the terminology from our use table. Single-family detached. That's the freestanding single-family structure. The only mixed-use district where that's permitted is MU3. Same with a 2-family dwelling unit. MU3 is the only mixed-use district where single-family detached or doubles are permitted under the zoning regulations. Triplexes and fourplexes and single-family attached, the row houses, the townhouses, those are permitted in MU2 and MU3. Multifamily, 5 or more units, permitted in all 4 of the mixed-use districts. The live-work unit, that new concept that we're introducing where you have a residential adjacent immediately as part of your living unit where you work, small studio or whatever, that live-work concept, that's allowed in all 4 mixed-use districts. So that's one way of distinguishing them as by what types of household living units are permitted. Group living, that's another important element of residential. You'll see assisted living permitted in all 4 of the mixed-use districts. Group homes permitted in MU1, MU2, and MU3, but not in MU4. A nursing home, that's permitted only in MU2. Transitional living, it can be an accessory, an accessory use in MU1, MU3, and 4, but not in MU2. So again, there are distinct differences across the mixed-use categories. When we go into the public and institutional uses, there are some notable distinctions. Post-secondary schools, the private business schools, permitted in all 4 mixed-use districts. A club or a lodge, only in the MU1 or MU2, not in the MU3 or 4 where we're trying to attain a denser use. So the club's only in MU1 and 2. Community center, you can see MU1 through MU3. A daycare center or nursery school, it can be an accessory use in MU1 and it's permitted in all the other districts, trying to get that complex of multiple uses within the zoning district. Museums, libraries, art galleries, again, accessory only in MU1, permitted in MU2 and 3 and 4. But you'll note there's an asterisk there, and when you see that in your take home and use this, I put the asterisk there because that's to let you know this use has a size limitation in the use-specific standards. So be sure to when you come across this use, look in the use-specific standards, because there are size limitations specifically for mixed use. Religious uses, special exception in MU1, permitted in all the others. But again, MU3 and 4, there's a size limitation. So you can see where there are different uses permitted in each of the districts. Healthcare, this is one. Medical and dental offices, we're trying to create offices as an option in all 4 districts. So that it's permitted, no size limitation. Laboratories in the MU2 through 4, no size limitation. Plasma center, only by special exception in MU3 and 4. It's along a transit corridor. It has access. It's permitted, but only by special exception. Yes? Yes.
When you say schools, elementary and high school, are there differentiation between charter schools and public schools?
We do not make a distinction by if they're charter,
That's
public,
what
or private.
I just remember there was some discussions back with parents about charter schools. They came up with zoning for that.
Okay. Yeah. The question was for the schools, they are permitted in MU2, and we do not make a distinction between charter schools, public schools, or private schools from elementary to high school. They're all permitted in the MU2. Again, here we go on to the agricultural, animal, and food related. Does that artisan food and beverage ring a bell from last time when we were talking about emerging the microbreweries as an example? Those are permitted in MU2, 3, and 4. It can be an accessory use in MU1, but it has specific size limitations. Farmers market, we want to encourage that. It's permitted in MU2. It can be an accessory use in MU3 and 4. Again, we don't want it to dominate the use of a particular lot. The commercial industrial categories, the home, business, and personal services. Again, you can see where it varies by district as far as what's permitted. Tattoo parlors are permitted in MU3 and 4, but only with a special exception. Outdoor advertising signs permitted only in MU2, 3, and 4, and in MU2 there's a size limitation. Consumer services permitted, but with a size limitation. So I hope you're getting the flavor of distinct differences across the mixed-use districts in terms of what are permitted uses. And I can't emphasize enough, if you see an asterisk, that tells you that use has a size limitation in the mixed-use district. So always be sure to look it up. Hotels and motels, we're permitting those in MU1, 3, and 4, but not the neighborhood-based MU2 district. So we're trying to keep the scale of permitted uses. This one I want to stop on because I talked about how mixed-use districts can go into some categories besides just commercial, retail, office, and residential. Specifically, we are permitting artisan manufacturing. That's that small scale, small batch manufacturing. We're permitting it in an MU1 only under the vacant provision. The vacant provision is an existing building's been vacant for 5 or more years. We have had C2 buildings in place for years, so we're accommodating the possibility there might be some vacant buildings already in place in MU1. but only vacant buildings can have the artisan manufacturing in MU1. MU2, 3, and 4, we're permitting it. But there is a size limitation. There is a size limitation. Light manufacturing, we have it as permitted, but again, this would be that new category of light manufacturing, just the assembly of materials, no transformation. Offices, permitted in all of the districts.
Those vacant buildings, not lots, right?
Correct. The V provision is for vacant buildings, not vacant lots. Research and development. This is something the city's part of its economic development strategy. We wanted to accommodate it, but acknowledge there might be some types of research and development that wouldn't work in all of the districts. So agricultural research and development, not in any of them. Clean energy, only in the higher density ones. Information technology, all of them. Life sciences, the higher MU3 and 4. Logistics, permitted in all of them. So we're trying to accommodate, as possible, this economic development focus for the city. Retail uses, you'll see it's not a wide range of permitted uses. We've narrowed it to department stores, the larger kind of retail sales place, only in the MU3 and 4, only in that more intense multifamily district. A grocery store is permitted in all of the mixed-use districts, but again, there's a size limitation. So be sure to double check the size limitation for grocery stores. We want to encourage grocery stores where we also have residential, so that's why we allow it, but we do set a size parameter. Liquor stores for the multiple tenants. Pawn shops only by special exception. Retail, light general, that's that. You take it with you, 75 pounds or less. Permitted in all of them, but what we've established in the MU1 district is only as an accessory use. You cannot have a light retail store as the whole entire use of a building in the MU1. Key thing, what we call heavy retail, the larger items, not permitted in any of the mixed-use districts. Lastly, some of the key other uses that might be of interest to you. Notice, wireless communication and utility distribution points. We make it clear where those are permitted. Automobile fueling stations, only in the MU3 district, and then only by special exception. We're trying to de-emphasize the automobile as an aspect of mixed-use development. So, only in the MU3 and only by special exception. When you think about the use table, that beige section at the end, you also want to check it for what are permitted accessory or temporary uses in the mixed-use districts. I won't go through all of them, but again, we've specified what accessory uses, what temporary uses are permitted in the mixed-use districts. But again, look to see if there are use-specific standards that apply only to the mixed-use district, and you have to read through to find those. Lastly, I want to highlight just a couple of other aspects of development in the mixed-use district. We talked about this once before in general, but there are sidewalk standards in the mixed-use district based upon the street type. If it's a local street or a cul-de-sac, minimum 5-foot wide sidewalks. Any other street must have an 8-foot sidewalk. We haven't talked about the green factor yet. That's upcoming, but just to know, the green factor scoring does not apply to mixed-use districts. If it's in a mixed-use district, it does not have to go through the green factor scoring. That's an important distinction. The reason behind that, I won't steal Tamara's time, we're trying to get that combination of uses, and at least at the outset, the green factor didn't seem to work with a mix of uses in a given location. So they are excluded from that now. Chain link fences in the mixed use district permitted only in the side and rear yards, and they must be dark in color. And that's reflecting that we are having this combination of residential as well as commercial and light industrial uses. So you can have them, but only in the side and rear yards, and must be dark to kind of help screen them a little bit. And you cannot do the privacy slots in a chain link fence. Kind of taking you all the way through mixed use districts. Again, just to recap, we're trying to get that combination of uses in locations outside of the regional center. We allow a mix of using in the building or in adjacent buildings. You can have single purpose buildings in the mixed use district. We're trying to encourage transit supportive development. We have smaller front yard setbacks in all of the mixed use districts. We're trying to create that pedestrian friendly build out. There are parking regulations that are unique to the mixed use districts. And looking ahead, when we get to the MU 3 and 4, it will require Metropolitan Development Commission action on a plan before any area can be rezoned into MU 3 and 4. So that's, in a nutshell, the mixed use districts. Thank you so much for your attention.